find somewhere comfortable. You don't need to follow this closely. You don't need to remember any of it. Just let the words arrive softly, the way a quiet sound drifts through a window at night, and then let them pass. If today was hard, you don't need to carry it anymore. Whatever you brought with you into this hour, you can set it down now. There's nothing here that requires your effort or your concentration. Just the slow drift of a voice and a story that has been waiting a very long time to be told. Tonight we're going somewhere small, somewhere most people walk past without noticing. We're going down to the ground, to the edge of a meadow or the crack in a warm stone wall, to the place where a thin line of tiny creatures moves with a patience and a purpose that is, when you really look at it, one of the most quietly astonishing things in the natural world. We're going to spend some time with ants. Not because ants are exciting exactly, but because there is something in the way they live, the way they move together, the way their whole colony breathes and thinks and solves problems without any single one of them knowing what is happening. That feels like it has something to say about the nature of things, about how complexity can grow from simplicity, about how rest and order can emerge from what looks, up close, like gentle chaos. So settle in. Close your eyes if you'd like. The story will find you wherever you are. Somewhere beneath your feet, right now, there is almost certainly a world you've never seen. Not a metaphor, not a poetic flourish. A literal, physical world. A network of tunnels and chambers, carefully excavated over weeks and months, maintained by thousands of small bodies, ventilated with surprising precision, kept at a temperature that barely varies regardless of the weather above. A city that has been there longer than most things you think of as permanent. It is said that if you were to weigh all the ants on Earth, their combined mass would be roughly equal to the combined mass of all the humans. Some estimates suggest it would exceed it. There are, by current reckoning, somewhere in the range of 20 quadrillion individual ants alive at this moment. That is a number so vast it becomes almost soft and dreamlike when you try to hold it. A 1 followed by 16 zeros spread across every continent except Antarctica, filling every forest and grassland and garden and desert with their quiet, patient industry. And yet, for all their numbers, no single ant knows very much. No single ant has a plan. No single ant has ever looked at the colony from above and said, "Here is what we need to do today." The intelligence, the astonishing, almost eerie intelligence of an ant colony does not live in any individual. It lives in the space between them. It lives in the way they respond to each other, the way each small action shapes the next, the way a kind of order assembles itself out of 10,000 tiny, simple decisions. This is what scientists have come to call emergent behavior. And it is, in its quiet way, one of the most beautiful ideas in all of science. An American entomologist named William Morton Wheeler was among the first to give this phenomenon a name. In 1911, he wrote about what he called the superorganism, the idea that an ant colony is not simply a collection of insects living together, but something closer to a single living entity, with its workers functioning like cells, its different castes acting like organs, its collective behavior resembling the integrated workings of a body. Wheeler noticed that the colony seemed to breathe, to respond, to adapt, almost as if it were a creature in its own right. He wasn't entirely wrong. To understand how an ant colony thinks, you have to understand first how it speaks. Ants are largely blind, or nearly so. The world they navigate is not primarily a visual one. It is a world of chemistry, a world of scent, so rich and layered and precise that it is almost impossible for us to imagine from the inside of our own comparatively limited senses. Where we might see a landscape, an ant experiences something closer to a symphony of molecules, each one carrying information, each one shifting and fading and strengthening in patterns that the ant reads the way we might read a face. The molecules in question are called pheromones. And they are the foundation of everything. When an ant finds food, something very simple happens. It eats a little or collects a piece to carry, and then it turns around and walks back toward the nest. As it walks, it deposits tiny amounts of a chemical compound along the trail behind it. Not consciously, not deliberately in the way we'd use the word, but as an automatic, hardwired response to having found something worth sharing. The pheromone fades in the open air over time, evaporating slowly in the warmth of the day. Now, another ant leaves the nest, moving more or less at random, exploring. It crosses that faint chemical trail. Something in its nervous system responds. It turns, follows the scent, finds the food, and on its way back, it lays its own pheromone trail on top of the first. A third ant follows. And a fourth. Each one reinforcing the trail. Each one making it slightly more likely that the next ant will follow the same route. Within a short time, what began as a single ant's wandering has become a well-worn highway, a river of small bodies moving back and forth with a kind of smooth, unhurried efficiency that looks, from a distance, almost deliberate. But here is the beautiful part. The trail is not just reinforced when it leads to food. It is also quietly abandoned when it doesn't. If the food source runs out, the ants that travel there find nothing and they return without reinforcing the trail. The pheromone evaporates. The path grows fainter. Fewer ants follow it. Eventually, it disappears entirely, and the colony's attention shifts, without anyone having made a decision, to wherever the stronger trails now lead. This is what scientists call a positive feedback loop, paired with its natural opposite. The system amplifies success and quietly dissolves failure. It is self-correcting without needing to be controlled, and it produces with remarkable reliability the shortest available path between the nest and the food, not because any ant knows where the food is, not because any ant has measured the distance, but because the shortest path is walked most quickly, the pheromone on it is refreshed more often before it can fade, and so it becomes, over time, the strongest signal. The researcher who studied this most deeply and whose work transformed how we understand not just ants but the nature of collective intelligence itself was a man named Edward O. Wilson. Wilson spent decades at Harvard watching, recording, experimenting, and writing about ants with a love for them that was almost tangible in his prose. He was the one who mapped the chemical vocabulary of ant colonies, identifying the specific compounds used for different messages, the alarm signals that spread panic through a nest, the trail markers that guide foragers, the recognition chemicals that allow ants to tell nestmates from strangers. Wilson once described an ant colony as a factory that is also a fortress, that is also a family. He meant it as a way of capturing the complexity of what's happening, the way a colony is simultaneously producing, defending, and nurturing all at once, all without a single point of central control. The word he might also have used is elegant. Because that is what it is. A system that achieves so much through so little. A language made entirely of chemistry, patient and slow and ancient. There is a particular kind of ant that builds its home from leaves. Leafcutter ants, found across Central and South America, are among the most studied and most quietly remarkable creatures on the planet. They are easy to spot if you're in the right place. A long procession of them, each one carrying a piece of leaf many times its own body weight, moving through the undergrowth in a column that can stretch for hundreds of meters. They look, to the casual observer, like a river of green confetti, animated, and purposeful. But here is the thing that stops you when you learn it. The leafcutter ants don't eat the leaves. They carry those leaves underground into their vast, complex nests, which can extend several meters below the surface and house millions of individuals. They chew the leaves into a fine paste, and then they use that paste to grow a garden, a fungus garden, cultivated with extraordinary care, tended by specialized workers who remove contaminants, regulate humidity, and harvest the fungus for food. The ants are farmers. They have been farmers for somewhere between 8 and 10 million years, which means they invented agriculture roughly 8 million years before we did. The fungus they grow cannot survive without them. They have been cultivating it for so long that it has lost the ability to reproduce on its own. It is entirely dependent on the ants, and the ants in turn are entirely dependent on it. A relationship so old and so intertwined that it has become, in the most literal sense, a single system. Now think about what it takes to maintain that system. The nest itself is a feat of engineering. It contains hundreds of chambers of different sizes, connected by tunnels that are arranged to allow the circulation of air, to maintain the right temperature and humidity for the fungus, to separate the nurseries from the fungus gardens from the waste disposal areas. There are refuse chambers where dead ants and spent fungus material are deposited, located always at the very edges of the nest, away from the living areas, in a way that minimizes the spread of disease. None of this was designed. There is no architect. There is no foreman. There is no ant who looked at the ground and said, "We will put the nursery here, and the garden there, and the waste disposal over in that corner." What there is, instead, is a principle called stigmergy. It is a word coined by a French biologist named Pierre-Paul Grasset in the 1950s, and it describes a particular kind of indirect communication where individuals modify their environment, and those modifications in turn influence the behavior of other individuals. An ant deposits a pellet of soil. Another ant, passing by, detects the pellet and is slightly more likely to deposit its own pellet nearby. A structure begins to form. The structure itself becomes the signal, telling other ants what to do next. No ant ever has a picture of the finished nest in its mind. Each ant just responds to what is immediately around it. And from that local, simple chemical responsiveness, a structure of extraordinary complexity emerges. Tunnels that have been precisely engineered for ventilation. Chambers that maintain stable microclimates. A city built by 10,000 small bodies following rules they were born with, producing something none of them could have imagined. Researchers at Stanford University published a study in 2022 looking at weaver ants, the species that constructs its nests by pulling living leaves together and binding them with silk. The ants use their own bodies as living tools, forming chains and clusters to hold leaves in place while other ants stitch them together. The study found that the ants use a distributed feedback system to decide where to pull and when to stop, each one responding to the tension it feels in its own body and the positions of its neighbors. The result is a structure that is, by engineering standards, impressively stable. Not because any ant understands structural mechanics, but because the collective behavior, shaped by simple physical feedback, converges on solutions that work. There is something in this that is worth sitting with for a moment. The idea that you don't need to understand the whole to contribute to something whole. That doing one simple thing in response to what is immediately around you can be part of something vast and intricate and beautiful. Memory is a strange thing. We tend to think of it as something that lives inside a single mind, a personal archive of experiences, stored and retrieved by the same individual who lived through them. but the ants have something to say about that assumption. Researchers at the University of Lausanne have been exploring what happens when an ant colony accumulates knowledge over time. Not individual ants learning, but the colony as a whole, developing a kind of distributed memory, a record of what has worked and what hasn't, stored not in any single brain but in the structure of the colony's behavior, in the patterns of its trails, in the subtle ways that groups of ants respond to situations they have encountered before. What they found was genuinely surprising. Colonies that had been exposed to a particular foraging environment, even after the individual ants involved in those early explorations had died and been replaced, showed behavior that reflected the earlier experience. The colony as a whole seemed to remember, not in the way you or I remember. No vivid recall, no narrative, no sense of recognition. But in a functional way, the way a river remembers the shape of its bed, the way a forest remembers a fire, in the way it grows back. This is a form of memory that lives in the relationships between things rather than inside any one thing. And it is, when you encounter it, a quietly humbling idea. Individual worker ants live, depending on the species, for a few weeks to a few months. But the queen of a colony, the single reproductive female at the center of the whole structure, can live for 20 or 30 years. Some queens of certain species have been recorded living for longer still. A single colony, built around a single long-lived queen, can persist for decades, outlasting the individual lives of millions of its members, accumulating experience and adapting to its environment across a span of time that is, for an insect, almost incomprehensible. And during that time, the colony is not static. It learns in its distributed way. It adjusts. A colony of leafcutter ants that has encountered a particular species of plant that is toxic to their fungus will, over time, stop harvesting from that plant. Not because any individual ant decided to avoid it, but because the trails leading to it were gradually abandoned as the fungus suffered and the trails to other plants were reinforced. The colony's behavior changed. The colony, in some meaningful sense, learned. There is something almost tender in this when you let it settle. The idea of a community that holds knowledge collectively, that carries the experience of its members even after those members are gone, that adapts and grows through the accumulation of countless small individual actions. No single part of it knows the whole, but the whole knows more than any part. A researcher at the Santa Fe Institute, working in 2023 on what they were calling biological computation, described ant colonies as natural computers, systems that process information and arrive at solutions not through centralized calculation, but through the parallel activity of many simple units. The metaphor is striking because it flips the usual assumption about intelligence. We tend to think of intelligence as something concentrated, something that lives in a large, complex brain. The ant colony suggests that intelligence can also be distributed, spread across a network, emerging from the interactions of parts that are individually simple. It is worth noting, as you rest here in the quiet, that your own brain works in something like this way, not in the sense that you are like an ant, but in the sense that the remarkable thing your brain does every night while you sleep, the sorting and consolidating and repairing and restoring, does not happen because some central command post issues orders. It happens because millions of neurons following their own local rules, interacting with their neighbors, produce collectively something that none of them could produce alone. The sleeping brain, like the ant colony, achieves its most important work through emergence. Through the quiet coordination of many simple things. There is a species of ant that does something so strange and so beautiful that it seems, when you first hear it, like something from a dream. Army ants, particularly the species known as Eciton burchellii, live a nomadic life in the rainforests of Central and South America. Unlike most ant species, they don't build permanent nests. They move. Enormous columns of them, sometimes hundreds of thousands strong, sweeping through the forest floor in a broad, living wave, consuming almost everything in their path. When the column encounters a gap, a crack in a log, a space between two roots, a distance too wide for a single ant to cross, something extraordinary happens. Ants stop at the edge. They grip the surface. Other ants walk over them. More ants stop, grip, and become part of the structure. Within minutes, the gap is filled by a living bridge made entirely of ant bodies, each one holding on, each one supporting the weight of the ants passing over it, each one contributing to a structure that will dissolve back into individual ants as soon as the column has passed. The bridge builds itself to exactly the right width, not wider than necessary, because every ant in the bridge is an ant, not foraging, not contributing to the hunt. The colony calibrates the structure through the same kind of distributed feedback that governs everything else it does, to the precise dimensions needed for efficient crossing, no more, no less. This is not a decision any ant makes. It is a decision the colony makes, in the way the colony makes all its decisions, through the accumulation of many simple local responses that converge, somehow, on the right answer. There is a particular quality to this image that feels worth holding for a moment before we move on. The image of small bodies making themselves into a bridge, of individuals becoming, temporarily, part of a structure, giving their movement over to a larger purpose, and then, when the purpose is served, becoming individual again. It is the kind of image that sits quietly in the mind and does something there. The army ants also construct what they call bivouacs, temporary nests made entirely from living ant bodies where the colony shelters during its periods of rest. The ants link their legs and antennae together, forming a dense insulating mass around the queen and the brood. They regulate the temperature inside this living nest by adjusting how tightly they cluster, opening small gaps to cool the interior, closing them to warm it. The bivouac breathes in its way. It responds. It is the colony at its most literally superorganic, a single structure made of living parts, maintaining its own homeostasis, protecting its most vulnerable members through the collective warmth of its own bodies. T.C. Schneller, an American behavioral scientist who spent decades studying army ants in the mid-20th century, described watching a bivouac form as one of the most affecting experiences of his scientific career. There was something in the sight of it, he wrote, that made it very difficult to maintain the usual emotional distance of the scientist. It looked, he said, like something caring. Whether or not caring is the right word for what the ants are doing is a question that science cannot yet fully answer. What it can say is that the behavior, whatever its inner nature, produces outcomes that we would recognize from the outside as protection, warmth, and shelter. The colony looks after its own, through no individual act of love, but through the collective expression of 1,000 simple behaviors. It produces something that functions, in the world, the way love functions. There is something very quiet and very patient in that thought. We have been traveling for a while now, through the underground cities and the leaf-strewn trails and the living bridges of a world smaller than your thumbnail. If you've drifted somewhere along the way, that is entirely fine, more than fine. The story has been here softly, and you have been here softly too, and that is enough. But before the words slow entirely, there is one last thing worth mentioning. A connection between the world of the ant colony and the world you inhabit right now, in this bed, in this quiet hour. The brain, your brain, the one that has been gently following this story through the dark, is doing something tonight that it does every night, something that science is only beginning to fully understand, and that has in its deep structure a remarkable resemblance to the emergent logic of the colony. When you sleep, your brain does not simply switch off. It shifts. It moves through stages, each one characterized by a different pattern of electrical activity, a different rhythm that can be measured in cycles per second. In the lightest stages of sleep, your brain produces waves in the range of 4 to 8 cycles per second, a frequency that researchers associate with the processing of memory, the gentle sifting of the day's experiences, the sorting of what to keep, what to let go. Deeper still, in the slow, heavy stages of sleep that feel like falling into something vast, the brain slows further, to somewhere between half a cycle and 4 cycles per second, long, rolling waves that wash through the cortex like tides. This is where the most profound restoration happens, where the brain clears the metabolic byproducts that accumulate during waking hours, where the body releases the hormones that repair and renew. And in REM sleep, the dreaming stage, the brain becomes briefly busy again, flickering with activity that resembles wakefulness, processing emotions, consolidating procedural memories, running what might be thought of as low-risk simulations of experience. Testing things. Exploring. The way a scout ant moves out from the nest into unknown territory, not following any trail, just seeing what is there. None of this is orchestrated by a single point of control. There is no conductor, there is no master switch. The transitions between stages, the timing of the different rhythms, the coordination of the brain's vast population of neurons as they move together through the night, all of it emerges from local interactions, from the chemical signals passing between cells, from the feedback loops that amplify some patterns and quiet others. The sleeping brain is, in this sense, a kind of colony, not of ants, but of neurons, each one following simple rules, each one responding to its neighbors, each one contributing to a collective process that none of them individually understands, but that produces, in its totality, the most important thing your body does: rest. Real, deep, restorative rest. The kind that the researchers at the University of Lausanne might recognize in their way from the colonies they study. A system that accumulates the residue of experience, processes it quietly, and emerges, in the morning, changed. Slightly more adapted, slightly more itself. There is something in the evaporation of pheromone trails that feels, tonight, like a useful image. The trails of the day, the worries and the urgencies and the things that felt so loud just a few hours ago, they are already fading. The pheromone is already evaporating. The paths that led to them are growing fainter, and your attention, like the colonies, is quietly, naturally drifting toward the trails that lead somewhere warmer and softer. The exploding ants of Southeast Asia, the species that ruptures its own body to protect the colony from threat, have a name in the scientific literature that sounds almost like a poem: Colobopsis saundersi. They are, in their way, an extreme expression of the principle that runs through all of this, that the individual, in service of something larger, can do things that seem to exceed what the individual alone is capable of. The colony asks something of each of its members, and each member, following only its own simple nature, gives it. You have given a great deal today, whatever form that took. The colony of your life, the people and the work and the small daily acts that make up the whole of it has drawn on you as it always does. And now the drawing is done for tonight. Now is the time of the bivouac, the time when the colony folds in on itself, when the living bodies cluster together for warmth, when the queen and the brood are protected by nothing more than the collective stillness of the many. You are allowed to be still now. The ant colony, for all its ceaseless industry, also knows how to stop. The bivouac is not a failure of activity, it is activity of a different kind. The rest is part of the work. The stillness is part of what makes the movement possible. Marco Dorigo, the Belgian computer scientist who in the early 1990s looked at ant foraging trails and saw in them the outline of a new kind of mathematics, spent years translating the logic of pheromone trails into algorithms that could solve problems no single computer could solve efficiently alone. His work, which became known as ant colony optimization, is now used in logistics networks, in the routing of telecommunications traffic, in the design of circuit boards, in the scheduling of tasks across vast distributed systems. The quiet, patient, emergent logic of the ant, scaled up and translated into mathematics, turned out to be one of the most powerful problem-solving tools humans have ever developed. All of it from watching a line of small creatures walk across the ground. All of it from paying attention to something most people step over without noticing. The world beneath our feet has been doing this for a very long time. The ants have been building their cities, laying their trails, growing their gardens, and forming their living bridges for more than 100 million years. They were here before the dinosaurs disappeared. They will very likely be here long after we are gone, patient, distributed, unhurried, and extraordinarily good at what they do. There is a kind of comfort in that if you let it arrive slowly. The comfort of knowing that the world is full of systems, older and stranger and more quietly capable than anything we have built. That intelligence, real intelligence, the kind that solves hard problems and builds lasting things and adapts to change, does not always look like what we expect it to look like. Sometimes it looks like a line of small creatures on a warm stone wall, each one following a scent, each one doing its small part, none of them knowing the whole, and the whole somehow knowing itself. The day is somewhere behind you now, distant and growing more so. The trails of it are fading, the way pheromones fade in the afternoon warmth, the way the colony's attention drifts from paths that no longer lead anywhere worth going. Beneath the ground, right now, in the dark and the quiet, a million small lives are going about their ancient work, building, tending, resting, breathing as a single thing. They have been doing this since before there were words for any of it. And you are here, in your own warm stillness, part of a world that is older and deeper and stranger than any single mind can hold. Drift now, if you're ready. Sleep well. There is something else worth knowing about the chemical language of ants, something that adds a layer of quiet complexity to the picture. The vocabulary is not small. Researchers have identified somewhere between 10 and 20 distinct pheromone compounds in a single ant species, each one carrying a different meaning, each one capable of being mixed with others to produce something closer to a sentence than a single word. An alarm pheromone released near the nest entrance doesn't just signal danger in a general way. The concentration of it, how much was released, how recently, how close to the source the receiving ant is standing, all of these variables shape the response. A faint trace of alarm scent might cause a worker to move a little more cautiously. A strong, fresh concentration triggers a completely different behavior. The ant becomes a soldier in an instant, its body chemistry shifting, its behavior reorganizing around a single purpose. Edward O. Wilson, who spent so many years mapping this chemical world, described the experience of watching a colony respond to an alarm signal as one of the most vivid demonstrations he knew of how information travels through a living system. A single ant detects a threat and releases its alarm compound. The ants nearest to it detect the signal and release their own. Within seconds, the alarm has spread outward through the colony in a wave, not unlike the way a single stone dropped into still water sends ripples moving in all directions at once. The colony knows something before any individual ant has processed what that something is. He also noted something that stayed with him for years. When the threat passed, when the disturbance was resolved or the danger retreated, the alarm did not simply switch off. It faded. Slowly, as the pheromone evaporated and was no longer refreshed, the colony's agitation diminished, not all at once but gradually, the way tension drains from a room after a difficult conversation has ended. The colony returned to calm through the same distributed, chemical, unhurried process by which it had become alarmed. There was no all-clear signal. The absence of danger was itself the message. There is something in that worth sitting with tonight. The idea that calm returns, not because something announces it, but because the signal for distress simply stops being renewed. The alarm fades when it is no longer fed. Some researchers have begun to study what happens in a colony when the chemical environment is disrupted, when the pheromone signals are scrambled or overwhelmed. The results are not chaos exactly, but something closer to confusion. A temporary loss of coordination, workers moving without clear direction, trails leading nowhere, the elegant, self-organizing system becoming briefly uncertain of itself, and then, slowly, a new equilibrium assembles. The colony finds its way back, not to exactly what it was before, but to something that works, something stable. The system is, in the language of ecology, remarkably resilient. Resilience is perhaps the most important word in the study of ant colonies, not because the ants are tough in any dramatic sense, but because the architecture of the colony, its distributed nature, its lack of dependence on any single individual, means that it can absorb loss and disruption and keep functioning. Remove 1,000 workers from a colony of 1,000,000 and the colony barely registers the change. The trails continue. The gardens are tended. The queen is protected. The system is larger than any of its parts, and so the loss of parts, while real, is not fatal. There is a gentleness to this kind of strength. It is not the strength of a wall, rigid and resistant. It is the strength of water, the kind that yields and flows around obstacles and finds its level again. The leafcutter ants have a problem that no individual ant is equipped to solve, and yet the colony solves it with a consistency that would impress any engineer. The problem is this. The fungus they grow is vulnerable to a particular mold, a pathogenic fungus called Escovopsis, which has been co-evolving with the leafcutter ants for millions of years, learning to infiltrate their gardens, learning to overcome their defenses. It is, in its quiet way, one of the oldest ongoing arms races in the natural world. The ants develop new chemical defenses. The mold adapts. The ants adapt further. Back and forth, across millions of years, neither side ever quite winning. But the ants have one advantage that the mold cannot match. They have a third partner in the relationship, a bacterium that lives on the surface of their bodies in a white powdery coating that you can sometimes see on the larger workers. This bacterium produces an antibiotic compound that suppresses the mold. The ants are, in a very literal sense, carrying their medicine with them. They have been doing so for so long that the bacterium has become as much a part of the colony's biology as the fungus itself. Cameron Curry, a researcher at the University of Wisconsin who has spent years studying this three-way relationship, described it as one of the most sophisticated examples of symbiosis in the living world. 3 completely different organisms, a fungus, a bacterium, and an ant, each entirely dependent on the others, each having shaped the others through millions of years of close cohabitation. The colony is not just a colony. It is an ecosystem. And maintaining that ecosystem requires a kind of distributed quality control that, when you trace its mechanisms, turns out to be just as elegant as the trail following and nest building we've already visited. The ants that tend the fungus garden are a specialized caste, smaller than the foragers, with behaviors finely tuned to the needs of the garden. They remove dead or contaminated material. They apply the antibiotic bacteria to areas that show signs of mold infection. They adjust the humidity of the chamber by bringing in dry material or moving moist material away. Each action is triggered by local cues, by the smell of diseased fungus, by the texture of the substrate, by the humidity against their antennae. No ant has a map of the garden's health. But the garden is healthy. There is a researcher who spent 3 years living adjacent to a leafcutter ant colony in the forests of Costa Rica, making daily observations, recording the behavior of individual workers, trying to understand how the garden maintenance decisions were made. Her name was Anna Dornhaus, and what she found was that the ants were not, as she had initially assumed, efficient in the way a factory is efficient, with every worker occupied and every task optimally assigned. Instead, she found that at any given moment, a significant proportion of the workers in the garden were doing nothing at all, standing still, apparently idle. Her first instinct was to wonder if she was misreading the data, but the pattern was consistent. A substantial fraction of the workforce, somewhere between a quarter and a third, was inactive at any given time. What she eventually concluded was that this apparent idleness was not inefficiency. It was reserve capacity. The inactive ants were available to respond to sudden demands, to surges in workload that couldn't be predicted in advance. When a section of the garden was damaged, or when the colony returned with an unusually large harvest of leaves, the idle workers became active almost immediately, filling the gap, absorbing the surge, allowing the system to respond to change without becoming overwhelmed. The stillness, in other words, was functional. The rest was part of the work. This finding has since influenced the design of human organizations, supply chains, and even hospital staffing models. The insight that a system without any slack, a system where every part is always fully occupied, is a brittle system, one that cannot absorb unexpected demands, is something the ants had worked out a very long time ago. The question of what an ant experiences, if it experiences anything at all, is one that science approaches carefully and with considerable humility. We know the ant's nervous system is small. A worker ant has roughly 250,000 neurons compared to the roughly 86 billion in a human brain. The scale of difference is almost too large to be meaningful, and yet, researchers who study insect cognition have found, in recent years, evidence of capacities that are more sophisticated than the simple reflex and response picture that once dominated the field. Researchers at the University of Toulouse, working with a species called Myrmica sabuleti, found evidence that individual ants can recognize themselves in a mirror, or at least respond to their own reflection in ways that suggest a rudimentary form of self-awareness. The study was careful, and the findings were qualified, as good science always is, but they were striking enough to prompt a serious reconsideration of what is happening inside the small head of an insect going about its daily work. More clearly established is the ant's capacity for something that looks, functionally, like teaching. A species called Temnothorax albipennis, studied by Nigel Franks and Tom Richardson at the University of Bristol, was found to engage in a behavior called tandem running, in which an experienced ant leads a naive ant toward a food source, pausing at intervals to allow the follower to orient itself, adjusting its pace to the pace of the learner. The leader slows when the follower falls behind. It waits. It proceeds only when the follower signals readiness by tapping its antennae against the leader's legs. The cost to the leader is real, and it is, in its quiet way, a remarkable thing to find in a creature with a nervous system smaller than a grain of sand. What it suggests is that the colony's distributed memory, the accumulated knowledge of roots and food sources and environmental features, is not simply stored in the trails and the chemical signals. Some of it is stored in the behavior of individuals, in the capacity of experienced ants to pass what they know to those who don't yet know it. The colony learns not only through the aggregate of many individual experiences, but through the deliberate transfer of knowledge from one individual to another. A human parallel is not hard to find. The knowledge that any community holds is not stored only in its records and its institutions. It is stored in the people who carry it and in the relationships through which they pass it on. The teacher and the student. The elder and the young, the one who knows the root and the one who is learning it for the first time. The ant's version of this is stripped to its simplest possible form. No words, no explanation. Just the patient, physical act of leading and the willingness to slow down for the one who is still learning. There is a desert ant found across the arid landscapes of North Africa and the Middle East that navigates in a way that has fascinated researchers for decades. The Saharan desert ant, Cataglyphis fortis, lives in one of the most featureless environments on Earth. The salt flats it crosses offer almost no landmarks, no trails, no chemical signals, because the heat of the desert surface destroys pheromones within seconds. And yet this ant forages alone, traveling hundreds of meters from its nest in search of the insects that die in the heat of the midday sun, and then returns home in a nearly straight line, covering the return journey with a directness that would be impressive in a creature with a much larger brain. What the ant is doing, researchers discovered, is keeping track of every step it has taken, every turn, every change in direction, integrating all of this information into a continuously updated calculation of its current position relative to home. This is called path integration, and it is a form of dead reckoning. The same basic technique that sailors use to navigate before GPS, keeping track of direction and distance traveled to estimate current position. The ant does this without any instruments. It uses the position of the sun as a compass. It counts its own steps, a fact established by a wonderfully precise experiment in which researchers shortened the legs of some ants by trimming them and lengthened the legs of others by attaching tiny stilts, and then watched where the ants ended up when they tried to return to the nest. The ants with short legs stopped short. The ants with stilts overshot. The ant was counting steps, and the length of its steps determined how far it thought it had gone. Rüdiger Huener, the Swiss biologist who spent much of his career studying Cataglyphis, described his decades of fieldwork in the Tunisian desert as among the most rewarding of his scientific life. Not because the desert was comfortable, it was not, but because the ant kept showing him things he hadn't expected. The more carefully he looked, the more sophisticated the navigation turned out to be. It had, in its tiny brain, a suite of navigational tools that worked together, each one compensating for the limitations of the others, producing a reliability that was, given the environment, remarkable. What strikes many people when they learn about Cataglyphis is the aloneness of it. Most ant behavior is collective, embedded in the colony, dependent on the chemical communication of the group. But this ant goes out alone, into a landscape that offers no trail to follow and no signal to guide it, navigating entirely by its own internal reckoning, and finds its way home. There is something in that image that resonates if you let it. The idea of carrying your own compass, of knowing where home is not because a trail leads there, but because something inside you has been keeping track all along. The night is deepening now, and the words are growing softer. There is a quality that the very best ant researchers seem to share. Something you notice when you read their accounts of their work, when you hear them speak about the creatures they have spent their lives studying. It is a kind of unhurried wonder, not the excitement of a new discovery, though that is there too, but something quieter, the sense of sitting with something that is very old and very patient and very good at what it does, and feeling, in its presence, a certain peace. Deborah Gordon, who has been studying harvester ant colonies in the Arizona desert for more than 30 years, returning to the same sites year after year, tracking the same long-lived colonies through droughts and floods and the slow changes of a warming climate, writes about her ants with an affection that is unmistakable even in scientific prose. She has watched colonies that she first encountered as young, establishing nests grow into mature, stable communities over decades. She has watched them adapt to change. She has watched them, in dry years, shift their foraging strategy in ways that conserve water, sending out fewer foragers, keeping more workers inside the cool depths of the nest. She has watched them, in wet years, expand their range and their workforce, taking advantage of abundance. She once described the colony as a kind of intelligence that is not located anywhere in particular, and that is precisely as large as it needs to be. She meant it as a scientific observation. But it sounds, in the quiet of this hour, like something else as well, like a description of something that has found exactly the right size and shape for the life it is living. The colony does not aspire to be larger than it is. It does not worry about what the other colonies are doing. It tends its garden. It follows its trails. It builds its tunnels and its living bridges and its bivouacs. It does what it does in the place where it is, with the resources it has. And it does it with a completeness that is, in its own way, a kind of contentment. Not a contentment that is felt, perhaps, not in the way you feel things, but a contentment that is expressed in the structure of the colony's life, in the way its activity fits its environment, in the way it has, over millions of years, become exactly what this particular corner of the world needed it to be. There is a researcher in Japan, Toshiyuki Nakagaki, who became well known in the early 2000s for a series of experiments with slime mold, a creature that is not an ant and not even an animal, but that shares with ant colonies the property of distributed, emergent intelligence. He presented the slime mold with a map of the Tokyo metropolitan area, placing food sources at the locations of major train stations, and watched as the mold grew outward, explored, and eventually settled into a network that closely mirrored the actual Tokyo rail network, one of the most efficient transit systems ever designed. The mold had solved, without a brain, without a plan, without any centralized intelligence whatsoever, a problem that human engineers had spent decades refining. Nakagaki was careful to say that he was not claiming the slime mold was intelligent in the way we use that word. What he was claiming was something subtler and perhaps more interesting, that the kind of problem-solving we associate with intelligence, finding efficient paths, balancing competing needs, adapting to constraints, can emerge from systems that have no intelligence in the conventional sense. That the solution can be in the structure, in the relationship between the parts, rather than in any mind that oversees them. The ant colony has known this for 100 million years. And tonight, in this quiet, in the dark behind your closed eyes, your own body is doing something not entirely different. The neurons that have been active all day, carrying the weight of your thoughts and your worries and your plans, are beginning to quiet. The chemical signals that kept you alert and engaged are fading, the way pheromone trails fade when they are no longer renewed. New signals are rising, slower and deeper, the ones that pull you down into the warm, heavy stages of sleep where the real restoration happens. You don't need to do anything to make this happen. Your body knows the way. It has been making this journey every night of your life, following its own ancient trail, finding its own way home to the deep rest that waits at the end of every day. The colony folds in on itself. The bivouac forms. The queen is warm at the center. The long night passes, and the work of rest is done.